Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome once again to this, the third and final installation of McMaster Philosophy Talks, Pondering the Pandemic. We started with a discussion on ancient philosophy in relation to COVID-19 and the lockdown, the things that we had to try to manage with being in isolation, being away from friends, fostering friendships on Zoom, and asking the question, what's in our control and what isn't, and how does that affect our happiness? Then we moved on last week to the discussion of evidentialism and decision-making. And with that, the decision to lock down and to emerge from lockdown, given that there isn't this perfect evidence that we might like to have to make a fully rational decision. And we found out that, well, these types of decisions, well, don't entirely rely on pure rationality, but things like emotion, belief, values, and maybe even faith. And today we're going to round off this series with a discussion on solidarity, the idea of whether things are in our common interests, what those might be, and how we can go about getting this thing called solidarity. Joining me today, if you are new, if you have not joined us before, I am James Sikkema. I teach philosophy here at McMaster University. I also do that in the community through my endeavor, Project Y. But joining me today is Stefan Skarafa. He is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy here at Mac. He's also the chair of the department and the advisor for the undergraduate major, Justice, Political Philosophy, and Law. His research interests are in the philosophy of law, political philosophy, and meta-ethics. And he's currently working on a book tentatively titled Law and the Morality of Political Community. If today's discussion interests you, please check out his website, www.solidaritydesign2019.com. I'm just going to throw that into the discussion in just a moment. But yes, solidaritydesign2019.com. Okay, so welcome, Stefan. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Continuing Education. Thank you to the Alumni Office and the Department of Philosophy for hosting this. If, again, you are new to these philosophy talks, then please, you are cordially invited to think along with us. This is an exercise in collective inquiry. We are focusing in on a topic, a range of questions. You are most welcome to join us in adding your voice. No question is off limits, so please access that Q&A, and I will do my best to respond to that question either by typing directly to you and to the group, or we'll raise it to Stefan during a lull in the action. If I don't get to your question, don't take it personally. Sometimes that goes quite rapidly, and I'll try to address everyone. Okay. So, without further ado, when we decided to engage in lockdown, the slogan #We are in this together gained popularity and became something of a mantra. We're in this together. We're in this together. And reminded us that these measures, these lockdown measures, equally affected us all. However, that we were all equally affected did not mean that the lockdown measures, that all of us were rather affected equally. For millions of Canadians, lockdown made them feel a distinct sense of isolation and loneliness and alienation and a corresponding feeling of depression, anxiety, and angst. What is more, millions of Canadians were disproportionately affected by both the virus and the measures undertaken to combat it. Historically racialized groups were disproportionately affected, Indigenous communities, vulnerable populations like children, the elderly, and individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities were all disproportionately affected by the lockdown measures. Furthermore, millions of Canadians found themselves unemployed. And those who were in the lower third of annual income found it really difficult, maybe still indeed find it quite difficult to make ends meet, even with the CERB aid perhaps coming their way. So Stefan, the first question that I want to pose to you and for us to think about is, how do these disparities, these inequalities, and in some cases maybe even inequities, square with this slogan, hashtag we are in this together?
Thanks, James. And let me just thank you more generally for putting this thing together. This is a great, I'm looking forward to the discussion, and it's just great that you've been injecting energy and making this thing happen. And also thanks to Alumni Advancement and to Continuing Education for putting this together as well. But in response, direct response to your question, I think the first thing I would say, and for what it's worth, my sense is that there really is a sentiment like we are in this together prevalent amongst government officials and in the community at large. I think a lot of people really are sincere when they say this, or even those that aren't issuing hashtags on the internet, folks just in their everyday language. There's an idea like this out there. So the sentiment's out there, and that gives us a kind of critical purchase on what the government's doing, what one another's doing, and all that kinds of stuff, because a lot of us are committed to something like this. And with that, of course, the next thing I'm going to say is, we're human. We're probably not living up to this commitment. And I just wanted to just emphasize a few ways that I thought were particularly salient. And it's not all of them. This isn't exhaustive. I'm sure other folks would have other things that they would show. But I just wanted to point out a few things in a little bit more concrete detail than your initial introduction of this idea, just to kind of fix our ideas and fix the conversation. And these things I just drew them from a couple of articles that I found on the CBC website. And the first article was it's dated June 13th. And it's titled "One Country, Two Pandemics." If anyone wants to go chase it down and chase down all the various things I say here, see if they're true or not. And from this article, I just wanted to cite two sets of observations. The first set of observations supports this idea that there's been a disparate impact of COVID in Canada along race, sex, and class lines. And so first, there's this CBC analysis of cases in Montreal that found a strong correlation linking higher rates of COVID-19 infections with low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods with higher percentages of Black residents. In the same vein, in early June, public officials in Ontario reported that the rates of infection and death from COVID-19 were disproportionately higher in the province's most ethnically and culturally diverse neighborhoods. Also, along these same lines, there are a lot of folks that are forced to live and work in what's described as a congregate setting. Things like meat processing plants, retail work, farm labor, prisons, both the workers and the inmates. These folks, they're in settings that have much higher than average rates of COVID infections, because of the close proximity in which the folks in these settings have to live and work. And then, of course, the workers in these settings are amongst the lowest paid workers in Canada. And also most of these folks are deemed essential workers. So they're not eligible for the kind of stay-at-home support benefits that a lot of other Canadians are eligible for. And then I would also add from the same article, you see that the incomes of women have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. And here I'm going to speculate, even today, most caretaking labor is unpaid, caretaking of children, and it's disproportionately borne by women even today. And so summer camp closings and school closings, a natural effect of that would be a disproportionate impact on women, on their incomes. Something else I'd like to point out from this article, this June 13th article, is that this outbreak has heightened conflicts of interests amongst Canadians. And here I'm just going to read this. There's a public statement from the president of the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, kind of the Small Business Association here in Canada. His name's Dan Kelly. He recently, it wasn't too long ago, he tweeted the following. While some workers are worried about returning to work for health-related reasons, many are happy to take the summer off if their income needs are taken care of through the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. So here you can see, like, look, there's a kind of breakdown of we are all in this together. Dan Kelly's like, get back to work. We need you to come work for us. We don't want you to stay at home and, get your, $2,000 a month, $1,500 a month or whatever that CERB is doling out. And then let me just conclude briefly with a couple of observations from a second article from the CBC. It's a little bit older. This article's a bit older. It's dated April 24th, and it's titled "By the Numbers." And it just reports on the amounts of projected costs to the Canadian government for supporting different sectors of the economy. And here's what looks like a really big number. As of May 28th, they were thinking that as of May 28th, the Canadian government will have spent almost $153 billion on direct contributions to individuals to support them during COVID. Things like the Canada Emergency, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, other direct, payments as well. And that looks like a huge number. But other sectors are also getting significant amounts of governmental support. In fact, amounts that are quite a bit more than all of these individuals are getting in Canada. So as of May 28th, according to this article, the total of government support in Canada was clocking in at something close to $1 trillion, which is big money for Canada. And most notably, the business and financial sector was projected to receive $300 billion in credit and liquidity supports through the Bank of Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And in addition, another $300 billion will be administered by the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions to free up capital for Canadian banks. So anyway, there's definitely, this suggests that there's disparate amounts of support. We have these direct contributions going to individuals, but there's also this torrent of support being pumped directly into the financial and corporate sector. Anyway, those are all data points suggesting that we're falling a bit short.
Yeah, thank you for that, Stefan. So that raises a number of questions, and one of the things that you mentioned was this idea that there's conflicts of interest, and certainly that the numbers seem to paint this picture that certain demographics are disproportionately affected by both the virus itself and the lockdown measures enacted to combat it, or at least plank the curve to not inundate our healthcare system. So it seems to reveal some inequalities that are perhaps built into our institutions or built into our social structure, and the types of groups that we have special interests in are either ourselves or that the state itself might have a vested interest in, that would perhaps distribute more benefit to them rather than something else that they may not have as much of an interest in. So one of the questions that just came up from Gregory, and he's asking this from all the way down under in Australia.
Oh,
yeah, is would Canada and maybe other states benefit from the World Health Organization, or perhaps maybe, Gregory, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe another governing agency taking oversight of the public record and keeping obligations for the pandemic? So have a more sort of universal oversight, so that states don't fall into their sort of unique situations and inequalities that preside.
So I take it, I could interpret that question in a couple of ways. One would be oversight as in actually, behaving sort of like a global executive. And I am, I suspect that would have all kinds of, that wouldn't be very feasible. That would be a tremendous undertaking. But there's something that's related that might be feasible. I'm just not sure. And I could certainly see how it'd be useful for the sake of maintaining a we are in this together mentality. Something that could be very useful would be something like, sort of like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where some international impartial agency was tasked of just basically keeping the books, like how much is being spent by all these governments on the various sectors, a kind of an audit. And that could be a way of helping to keep people honest. That wouldn't involve some global agency actually making these decisions for
Right. Yeah.
all these localities.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Still, though, it seems that the hashtag we are in this together does seem to be encouraging each of us as individuals, as members of a society, in this case, Canadian society, to engage in something like a shared effort in order to secure our common interests, whatever those might be. And maybe we can we'll try to zero in on that. But essentially, if we act in this concerted effort together, we will protect and promote this common good. And in political philosophy, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's the word for this, and it's solidarity. Rousseau says, for example, the following, quote, "One cannot injure one of the members of society without attacking the body. And still less can one injure the body without the members being affected." So there's this mutual interdependence that we have on one another for the simple fact of being members of a social group, of a society at large, the nation state. Can you maybe for our benefit explain this idea of solidarity further? What is it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to give my take on this. I mean, one thing I should say is, like any interesting notion, and philosophers contest what solidarity comes to. But I find appealing a tradition that I think is kicked off by Rousseau. He's who was an 18th century French-speaking theorist, and now Rousseau doesn't use the word solidarity, but he describes a kind of relationship that I think answers well to this word, and it's certainly what I have in mind when I use the word, and it's what I have in mind when I see the hashtag "We are in this together." And sort of the first stab or the first cut at Rousseau's idea, which, by the way, is continued on by figures like Hegel and Marx and John Rawls. Those are all figures. They have very different kinds of political philosophies, but they are united in having a basically Rousseauian idea of solidarity, or that's my take on them anyway. But anyway, according to this idea of solidarity, one main feature of that is that people live in solidarity when they're able to find a common ground that unifies them. And they're able to live in accordance with rules that furders, that common ground or furthers those common interests, and then subordinates any conflicting individual interests that the members of the groups might have, and that might set back that common interest. I think the easiest way in would be something like a sports team or a family. Those are easy examples. So each member of these groups, every family and every sports team, the members do have divergent interests. They have interests that can compete with one another's interests and conflict. But at least when they're well functioning, they live in solidarity because they share a common interest that they're all pursuing that helps each of them discipline and, cabin their conflicting individual interests. So one particular athlete's interest in being the most, colorful and, giving the most opportunities to take shots at the basket, that person will be likely to constrain that interest if that's what it takes to help the team achieve its common interest of, winning a lot of games. And you could say something similar about the members of family, where they might have a common interest in all the members of the family together thriving as a family. Now, something I would add, this is one feature, that there's this common interest, this common ground that unifies people that are living in solidarity or relating to one another in solidarity. But a key feature of Rousseau's notion of solidarity is that the rules that structure, the pursuit of this common ground, they are egalitarian in nature. So it's not enough just to have a common interest. You have to be structured in a relationship where you pursue that common interest in accordance with a bunch of rules that accord equal say to the participants in the group, and also accord equal consideration for the interest of each. So there's no, in a true Rousseauian solidaristic relationship, there's no LeBron James who's considered more important and whose interests count more and who has a greater say than others. In this true solidaristic relationship, the members of the group pursue the common interest in this egalitarian fashion. That's the full understanding, a more complete picture of the Rousseauian account. And so in the pursuit of Rousseauian solidarity, there's no faction or part of the group that's able to impose its interests or its will on other members of the group. By living in solidarity, that's a way that everyone can avoid domination by any particular faction or individual.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, according to Rousseau, or this Rousseauian tradition as you characterize it, so we need to have something like a common ground, common interest, and the willingness to subordinate our individual interests to that common interest. And then maybe, would it be accurate to say that solidarity is what we get, or the vehicle, what we get by virtue of subordinating our private interests or partial group interests to this common interest? And then we get solidarity, or do we need the solidarity? Do we need to have some sense of common interest and then be willing to work toward it?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. To achieve solidarity, the members of the group must have a common interest that grips them, and they must all share a disposition to bend and shape their conflicting private interests when necessary to realize that common interest. Just like the basketball player who will, okay, I'll sit the bench for a little bit if I need to, so that the team can, so that we, including me, can achieve our goal of winning the most games possible.
Okay, thank you for that. So one of the questions that arose as you were giving that definition, and that explanation of solidarity was, well, can we have something like a universal income then? Would that be a manifestation of this solidarity? Would pull, as the description of our participants, that it would pull folks out of poverty and create more of a level playing field and provide for mutual benefit. So something like a universal income in keeping with this solidarity, this notion of solidarity?
Yeah, so in this tradition of political philosophy, there are more and less radical claims about what's required to achieve this kind of egalitarian solidarity, to achieve this group's pursuit of a common goal and interest in a way that accords equal consideration of the interest of each, right? And one argument by some folks in this tradition is to get that, you need a basic income. Just to tip my hand for what my politics are like, or my view is when it comes to this set of issues, I actually would argue for something a bit more radical than that. I actually think universal income doesn't go far enough. It's not the right kind of thing to answer to the needs and demands of solidarity. I would argue that something more like a sovereign wealth fund, like you have in Alaska or Norway, where everyone has ownership in, every individual person has a measure of ownership in the in the firms or the companies that, produce goods in the society, you need something like that to achieve solidarity. I can't argue for that right now, but I think I'd like to indicate to the person that posed this question that there's a very live debate within this tradition about what kinds of policies are required to get the requisite form of solidarity.
Thank you for that. So as you're talking, some really interesting questions have just popped in. I'll ask the first one. This is from Aurelia Shaw, and she says, it sounds as though the assumption is that everyone in the society has equal agency for this sort of ideal of solidarity. And the question is, how does this idea of solidarity include people that we were just talking about, that COVID-19 has shown to be more vulnerable, such as older, frailer people in long-term care facilities?
Yeah, well, I think what it means is that a big part of the policy work, it implies a demand to put into place policies that treat the interests of those folks equally, and tries to put them in a situation where they can maximally exercise an informed and coherent say about how we're going to organize ourselves as a community. So I think this is absolutely important. I mean, this is extremely important, and it's stuff that, to my mind, should be at the cutting edge of political philosophy and policy work. Devising these policies and thinking through these questions.
And then the other question is from Bill Adams. He is asking, I think in a way connected to this, because it really is. I think this question is more geared to, well, the idea of common interests, and well, do we have collective recognition of what that would be? Do we have to agree on it? So this sort of connects with what we were talking about last week with Alex Klein and saying, well, if we're going to make some kind of decision, well, we have to have a discourse about, well, what our values are, what our beliefs are, what counts as factual evidence, and on what grounds, the degree of probability, and then the degree of epistemic warrant those things might have. So Bill is asking, can you explain the role of science in creating the common view of the pandemic? So when science view is questioned, as it has been in the US, it seems that, according to him, he says that we're all in this together seems to fall apart. So I think unless Bill corrects me, it seems that the idea is like how much uniformity of conception or consensus do we need to have in order to get this solidarity? We're sort of prefiguring what we're going to be talking about in just a minute, but maybe you can tip your hand a little bit here.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out a key feature of this tradition. And I think this actually is a different angle on what we're going to talk about in a little bit. But a key feature of this tradition is this imperative to avoid domination relationships, where one set of interests within the society is being imposed upon the rest of the society. One set of private divergent interests are being imposed on the rest of society. And one part of this tradition, beginning with Rousseau, Marx spells this out a lot as well, is that oftentimes when you have a society that's not in solidarity, where there is not a robust common interest, where there's not a robust disposition to cabin one's potentially conflicting divergent interests, in favor of the common interest, what you get is the production of ideologies and falsehoods whose function is to enable the imposition of one set of interests on others. And so here, the idea is that, look, actually solidarity is a necessary condition. It's a necessary condition of robust epistemic practices like science. Like the creation and transmission of scientific truths is something that we do collectively. And if we don't have solidarity in a society, then we're going to have a lot of incentives to muddy and distort that scientific truth creating process. So, one way in with this tradition is to say, look, part of the project is to forge people who have interests that aren't conflicting in this way, so they're not incentivized to, to rationalize their imposition of their interests on one another.
Thank you. Okay, so now that we have this this idea, and we're really thinking through it, but sometimes it's helpful to think of the converse or the opposite in order to really place the focus on this idea. And now we want to really imagine, well, what is so important about solidarity as you characterize it? Why is this necessary, or why do we need to really pay attention to it or to think about it and to get it? So imagine that we had this sort of opposite slogan to "We are in this together," like sort of something like maybe hashtag every group for themselves. And that would seem to presuppose that these special groups we form stand in isolation from one another, and that this isolation places an obligation on each group to care only about their special interests. How would, in your estimation, how would living in such a factious society, so you use this term faction in relation to James Madison, and that Rousseau was also wary of this, that these sort of special groups would form. So if we had this hashtag every group for themselves, how would that affect solidarity? How would this every group for themselves society affect our sense of solidarity?
So one thing I would say, I think something that's particularly realistic or true to life of the way you frame that question is that one way that folks can achieve solidarity is by forming a group that's opposed to another. And so you get solidarity within these factions, or something like it anyway. But you don't have solidarity, you don't have common ground across groups. And the problem with that is that you risk getting a kind of destructive competition of interests when you don't have solidarity across groups. And you risk putting people in a position where it's a zero-sum game between the groups. And so the groups are hostile to one another and are mutually aimed at setting back the interests of their opposed group. And that, when you scale that up, a whole bunch of groups like that in a society, that's a really ugly society. That's a society where people are backbiting and pulling one another down, as opposed to living in a productive, as Hobbes would put it, a world of commodious living and cooperation. That can become very quickly a cruel and precarious and anxiety-provoking world. And I think, let me just mention again, Kelly's statement. Now, I don't want to pile on this Kelly guy. I think he's just a creature of the institutions that he finds himself in. But Kelly, his statement says, and remember, Kelly's the president of the Small Business Association in Canada. His statement is just a little hint of this kind of cross-group, zero-sum game conflict of interest. I'll just read it again. He says, while some workers are worried about returning to work for health-related reasons, many are happy to take the summer off if their income needs are taken care of through the CERB. And here, this is a manifestation. Like, look, he's trying to set back the interest of his workers because he needs them to come work, for all these small businesses. And that's a world where what you've done is you've structured groups who are in competition with each other. I'm not going to blame poor Don for Kelly. I mean, that's the role that he happens to occupy in this economy. And now he's in this non-solidaristic relationship, and he's trying to impose his group's interests on this other group. And that scales up to something really nasty and a loss of commodious living, cooperation, and those kinds of things.
So it sounds to me that solidarity, we can still have groups. We can still have groups that have their own special interests.
Yes.
And they can pursue those special interests, whether that's across religious commitments, economic interests, ideological commitments and interests. But at the same time, what we want to, in order to get that wider, that commodious living that that you said that Hobbes is hoping to get in his social contract, we want to minimize the friction between these groups so that they're not competing for supremacy and this sort of hierarchy of power. And any sort of society that has that distribution according to special interest groups is going to suffer from this lack of solidarity.
Yeah, and one of the key ideas is that we have a bit of control over this because through law and through policies and our conventions, we create roles and we create groups that have their distinctive sets of interests, and so we can be in the business of interest and group, sculpting and engineering, so that we have a group of people who are capable of uniting around a common interest. They're not driven by predominating divergent interests.
So just how important would a society with citizens who have their private interests but are willing to subordinate them for common interests? How important is that for us to have a society worth calling a society, worth calling, and then worth saying that we are in fact in this together and can demonstrate that in meaningful ways?
So I think the idea, I think I've implicit in earlier comments is the answer to this question, which is, look, the idea is that we basically have two choices. One choice is to try to create a set of interests and unify our activities around a set of interests that we take as the interests that discipline our individual pursuits of our private interests, like some common ground that none of us will go beyond. We'll stay within those confines. The other possibility is just no holds barred. Everyone pursues their private interests as they may, and without constraint or acknowledging, this common ground that unifies and holds us together in some sort of harmony. And then the idea is that within this tradition, and I find it appealing too, is we need some version of that solidaristic relationship, because otherwise what you're going to have is this kind of war of all against all, where we're just boringly with each other in the zero-sum relationship, where some of us are trying to impose their interests on others of us. And either we're going to get kind of a chaotic war, or we're going to get the emergence of a set of folks who are capable of holding everyone else down in accordance with their interests.
Right. I mean, so one question that just came up is what would you say? So this is a fairly concrete question, but also something that the two of us and our colleagues at McMaster and other universities engaging with youth and in very concrete ways in the pedagogical exchange. The question that just came up was, well, how would you address this idea of solidarity with youth who feel incredibly alienated in contemporary society? So how do we address this sense of alienation, that we don't feel that we're part of this, that what maybe we might individually feel is in everyone's common interest seems to just be our own interest that isn't recognized by others who are doing their thing. So how would we address alienation and this trying to motivate people to act in solidarity as you were describing it when they feel so alienated?
Yeah. So my response is going to be, I don't know if this will be satisfactory to the questioner, but my idea is that this is just concrete policies that have been policy choices that we've made over the last 40 years or so. And to give you some examples, here's one big example. The cost of higher education in Canada for young people has increased 10 or 20-fold in the last 30 years in real dollars. And so young people are bearing, in the form of student loans, costs for obtaining that higher education that, as a matter of policy choice, we are no longer subsidizing. We no longer take it to be our common interest to make it easy to make it very easy for everyone who wants an education and is capable of one to get one, and then contribute to the common weal as an educated person who's typically more capable once they're educated. Something similar can be said about incomes. We structured society in a way to where incomes have stagnated over the last 40 years. And so even though that we've gone through this period of significant growth in average income or average GDP in Canada and other industrialized democracies, that has not been widely shared. And there's a whole suite of policies that have driven that. And so I don't blame folks for feeling alienated from the system, because the system actually is not serving their interests in the way that it could. And so then my answer is kind of a long game answer. It will be, once we get to the situation where we are now, it actually is difficult to appeal to the student who feels alienated, because they are in a systematic and structural way. But then the way to fix that is to intervene at this structural level. It's very hard to do anything about it once that cake is baked.
Now, you mentioned this, the structural level and the systematicity, institutional nature of this, this alienation in this case, or the inequality that we mentioned at the beginning of this talk. I'm not sure what that was, but
that was on my end. I just closed my email.
Okay. At the same time, though, we do have something. We have things enshrined, at least in the Western liberal tradition, that we have certain individual rights and freedoms, that we can pursue those in even not an anarcho-capitalist, but even a regulated capitalist economy. We can engage, we can freely enter into contracts that we find mutually beneficial. Those can form interest groups that then gain power and prestige and influence. And it seems that in some cases, those then influence the policies that we make that are going to then cause that alienation back down at the level of the individual, but within a different group. So one of our participants, Margaret, asks: Is a libertarian or a liberal political idea necessarily at odds with this idea of the common weal or solidarity? Is there a way to square that liberalism with solidarity? Do we or not?
So to my mind, and of course people can debate this, philosophers debate this, this is how they make their living, publishing articles and such and careers. But to my mind, the liberal rights, I think it's these liberal rights, like things like freedom of association, freedom of contract, certain property rights, these kinds of things, rights to political participation. To my mind, those things are necessary for the realization of solidarity, but they can be held up as in an insincere way, or pointed to in an insincere way, as a way of standing or getting in the way of the realization of solidarity. A key idea within this tradition is the idea of the fair value of persons' rights. And it's a really simple idea. There's a common sense way of putting it. Freedom of association is great. Freedom of political participation is great. But freedom of speech is great. All those things are great. But it's not really living up to its billing when some people lack the means due to policy choices to exercise those freedoms. Those freedoms can be dead letters for folks who are, 24/7 consumed with the needs to make a living, and they're barely hanging in there. Or for folks who live in a world where some people have easy access to higher education that is the entree into high income jobs and all kinds of mobility, but they're, for whatever reason, they didn't win that lottery, and so they're born into circumstances where it's not so easy to get that education. So it's not, the formal liberties are not enough on this view. You also need policies in place that that enable the realization of the equal and fair value of these liberties for everyone. To get the value of those liberties, you need those two things. You need this equal standing, or this equal starting point for all folks in order to activate the formal liberties. And in that case, then they are protective of solidarity.
Thank you for that. Okay, so now we've got this idea of solidarity. We've sort of situated it in society where we have inequalities, we have structural inequities, institutional forms of bias and prejudice, perhaps, but yet we still, it certainly still is something that we're going to need in order to be a society worthy of being called that we have this sort of relational obligation, and we might even be able to get those through these liberal mechanisms of protecting rights, individual rights and freedoms. But maybe we can say, maybe you could say a little bit more about how we might go about getting solidarity. So solidarity, again, it appears to demand that we act in certain ways that demonstrate that we care about our fellow citizens. So again, that hashtag "we're in this together" is some kind of call to our relational responsibility, that you owe it to your neighbor, even neighbors you've never met, the abstract neighbor, that this fidelity and this responsibility. We take their interests into account in our practical reasoning. But it would seem that for us to have such care, we would minimally need to have a shared conception of mutual benefit, two, a shared belief in what things will facilitate that benefit. So earlier in response to the alienation question, you said, well, this is at the level of policy, this is at the level of institutions. So what mechanisms, what's gonna facilitate that idea of common interests and mutual benefit? And then third, that we'll need to have a shared concern over the protection and promotion of those things. That we all need to mobilize collectively to preserve those things that are going to be, in fact, in our benefit, our mutual benefit, and then also foster those mechanisms that are going to facilitate them. So the question now becomes, well, how much consensus about our common interests do we need in order to obtain solidarity? How would we go about reaching this minimum consensus if we do need it? So maybe could you say something about that? So how much consensus do we need about what's really in our common interest if we can disagree about that?
So within this tradition that I find appealing, the idea is that there actually has to be quite a bit of consensus about the common interest. It doesn't have to be perfect consensus, but you have to be in the same ballpark, with one another. But within this tradition, the idea, there's this kind of faith that you'll get something like that. You'll get that needed consensus in large part by tamping down the conflicting interests of folks. And the idea is that in this tradition, the trick is to put institutions into place that cultivate interests among folks that mesh well and play well together, and that discourage the growth of interests that are at odds, that tend to pit people in these zero-sum relations. And let me give what I think Well, let me give a really, really simple example that distorts it a little bit just to get the intuitive idea. And then let me give a slightly more complicated, really concrete example. The simple example is to have a rule in your family for your kids when they're fighting about a piece of cake that says, look, one of you cuts the cake and the other of you picks between the two pieces. Okay, so that's trying to, jog your intuitions about what these folks are going about. Here's a more complicated idea. We might distinguish between two kinds of companies. In one company, so let's imagine maybe the steel mills in Hamilton, or I don't know what, or maybe McDonald's or something like that. In one company, there's a bunch of shareholders who own the company, and they have an interest. Just the law creates roles for them, the shareholder role. And if you're a shareholder, you just have an interest in maximizing your profit. I mean, that's what that role is all about, is maximizing your profit. Now, McDonald's has workers, and those workers, they have interest in maximizing their wage. And they also have interest in having as nice of working conditions as possible. Now let's kind of look at this from the solidaristic lens. Maybe we have to have a form of organization like that. Maybe there are reasons to do it. I'm not sure. I'm doubtful. But setting that aside, one thing to point out is that in a relationship like that, you have created two roles: these laborers and these shareholders who have interests that are fundamentally opposed. My profit increases as your wages decrease, and as your wage increase, that takes a bite out of my profit. So we've created a world with these roles, the role of laborer or employee at McDonald's and the role of shareholder at McDonald's. We've created a world with laws that creates people who occupy roles that have zero-sum interests like that. Now let's imagine another possibility where instead of a group of folks organizing with shareholders and owners and employees, imagine you have a group like the mustard seed, I think it's called, in Hamilton. It's a co-op. And the thing about co-ops is that they're owned by their workers. The workers own the co-op. And because the workers own the co-op, you don't have the same kinds, and they all have a similar kind of role where each of their interests are aligned. They have an interest in that co-op thriving and making a lot of money that's aligned across people in the co-op. Now, of course, not all the workers have some conflicting interests, but the idea is that those conflicts are more readily tamed because they have this common interest in this common enterprise where they're each owners of the co-op and invested in the success of the co-op. And so the idea in the solidaristic tradition of political philosophy is to come up with ways of organizing our work relations, the home, the economy at large, the political institutions, in ways where wherever possible, we can tamp down and eliminate conflicts of interests, these zero-sum interests, and we can introduce and, channel people or guide them toward aligning interests. So the way you get consensus is actually through this smart constitutional and policy design. That's the idea. And so a lot of the work is just done at that level. It's not done by, I don't know, directly teaching or getting into someone's face about what their interests should be. It's by putting them in structural situations where they just naturally have interests that align.
Thank you for that. Some of the questions that are coming up, one of them that just came up was that dealt with systemic inequality, systemic and institutional forms of racism or prejudice, where certain individuals, groups of individuals are denied access to things that we might want to say are in our common interest, basic rights and freedoms that are meted out to everyone, every individual equally. But because of our institutions that lack that sense of solidarity, that sense of that these common interests are such that no one has private right over. or the ability to benefit exclusively or disproportionately from them. So the question there was, how does a sense of solidarity help us to reckon with, and I think you got to this in what you were just saying, but how does this help us to reckon with these historical inequalities, this structural or institutional inequity? Of course, of moment right now is anti-Black racism and institutional or systemic racism, and it's become, that's a term that has been used so much that it might be losing its force at this point. But maybe this idea of solidarity can help us put the focus back on it in a constructive way. So can you speak to that? How solidarity, this idea of solidarity, can help us reckon with these historical inequalities?
Yes. So I think from this tradition, the one of the main thrusts is going to be that, look, you're not going to get very far at all by morally criticizing folks for their views or for their interests, for, say, their racist views, or for, you know, the interests that they have that are contrary to the "we're in this together" sort of spirit. Within this tradition, the idea is that the way to really go after these problems, to remedy this failure of solidarity, is at this level of constitutional and policy design. This is a bit too crude, but I think it just quickly gives you the idea. I mean, from within this tradition, one thought would be that, look, the reason why in the United States you've got racism against African Americans, you know, ultimately it has its origin in the fact that there was a particular kind of economic relationship, chattel slavery, where there were plantations, you know, that was a particular form of economy where production was done through the bondage of slavery. And that generated, you know, racist ideologies. And, you know, that's been unwinding in the States ever since. And then the idea is, look, to tackle ideology and attitudes that are generated by these economic relations, you need to, if possible, intervene in the social and economic relations and restructure that. The path to doing away with racism, you know, begins with, certainly doesn't end with, well, getting rid of slavery, chattel slavery. Then it turns out all along the way, there are more economic relations that are able to capitalize on these racist tendencies and continue to foment and stoke those flames. And the idea is that all along the way to remedy it, to get to the root of the cause, to remove the venom, you have to alter the problematic economic and social relations. That's the site of intervention. That's the basic view.
Yeah, so this is that's a nice segue into a question that that one of our attendees raised. They chose to remain anonymous, and that's perfectly fine. But the question there was, okay, well, so if we've got to really get to these institutions, the question is, do you believe that we would benefit from a utilitarian system then of framing or structuring our institutions?
So this could get deep in the weeds very quickly.
I'm trying.
I'll try. I mean,
Yeah.
The solidaristic tradition is anti-utilitarian. It rejects utilitarianism. And the main reason why is, I think the main reason why is because it thinks that utilitarianism does not take seriously enough the psychological dimension of the participants. Like it makes unrealistic psychological demands of the participants in this system. It puts them in a situation where, you know, the folks that lose out on the utilitarian calculus have no reason to buy in to the system. What the solidaristic model is saying is, look, we want to try to construct a system where everyone can happily realize their interests within the confines of a common interest, and so it's it's taking seriously the importance and the weight and the side constraint of the interest of each person in the group, and trying to create a world where everyone can realize their interests together in solidarity. Utilitarianism, is going to allow for just sacrifices from time to time when necessary to get the greatest aggregate interest.
Thank you for that. So let's move this into potentially choppy waters, and ask a really concrete but nonetheless significant and serious question. So, of course, on May 25, Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, sparking mass protests against anti-Black racism, police brutality, systemic injustice, still going on. We get another slogan emerging from this movement, hashtag defund the police. Is hashtag defund the police a similar call to solidarity as hashtag we are in this together? So, do we all have a relational obligation, regardless of our social position, to become allies in the fight to secure a more equitable society? And if so, what if we disagree on the means to achieving it? Maybe would love if you could weigh in on that.
Yeah, so I don't know if I have too much to say about what to do if we disagree on the means of achieving it, but I'll focus on the first part, which is, do I think of defund the police a call to solidarity? And maybe we can work our way to that second question a little bit. But I think to my mind, the most appealing interpretation of this, admittedly, I don't know, vague's not quite the right word, but I think different folks have different ideas of what it means, what its spirit is. To my mind, the most compelling interpretation is one where it is a call to solidarity. And as I see it, and I think the discussion that that's gone on, that we've had leading up to this, sort of kind of flows into this point. What I see this hashtag is it's a call to restructure our institutions in a more solidaristic way. It's a critique of the current structure of our institution of governance. And so, I'll try to put the point, remember I was talking about, look, we've created this role, this capitalist shareholder, and this other role, the laborer, and these two roles have conflicting interests. Well, I think one way to think about things is look, we've created this role, the police officer, we've created this role, these police agencies, and we've constructed them in a way where their job is to constrain and control, difficult to control populations in society. We've given them that job, and we've put them in a position where they view these populations as populations that are in need of control and that are difficult to control. And that's a problematic way of organizing things. That's a way of organizing things that creates, that undercuts the possibility of a common interest and convergent interests. And what I take defund the police to mean is it's not complete. It's not just defund the police. It's then replace the police with institutions that are better equipped to support these populations in the ways that are appropriate, where these populations are a much broader swath of the population than the ones that the police directly, constrain and control. So for me, the charitable interpretation of this hashtag is a plea to put a great deal of more money into social supports, much greater subsidies, say, for secondary and post-secondary education, transportation, healthcare support, greater childcare support, to tend to these various things which I would argue make up the common interest or contribute to the common interest. Moreover, the idea is that if these supports are provided, we won't need to spend nearly as much money on policing. Other agencies will deal with the set of issues relating to these various things that I just described: education, healthcare, mental health care, these kinds of things that have been foisted on the police. And of course, the police aren't well equipped to deal with this. They have a hammer, this kind of enforcement hammer, but not all these problems, can be fixed with a hammer. Also, I think it's probably true that by tending more, in the appropriate way to these various issues that the police have been charged with, crime rates will go down. This better educated, this better tended to, this population with better tended to health, mental health needs, more child care support, these kinds of things. A population like that is probably not going to be as unruly as the population that doesn't get it. So I think related to this is that, a common saying is that crime is an index of oppression. And I think that saying's basically right. To my mind, the state's failure to adequately tend to the common interest manifests a kind of oppression. And then I would add, but I think this has come out in the conversation already, that my personal politics are a bit more radical than the things that I've described, things like just greater subsidies for education, these kinds of things. I think appropriate institutional support of the common interest would go far beyond these kind of robust welfare state measures. But that conversation's for another day. But here I'll give a plug for my website. If you want to see some of that stuff, go check. You can go check it out at the website. It's not just me talking; it's a bunch of folks talking about this.
I think that's probably a good place to stop. Well, if you're up for it, can we end on one more question?
Please, I'd much rather do that.
Yeah. So this in the back of my mind, I'm sort of channeling folks in my life who would align with libertarianism and be very loath to give up what they would say is like more power and more influence to institutions. That we want what's beneficial to the common interest is the minimization of institutions, or at least centralized institutions. So this is in a way a question from one of our audience members, Justin, who asked, well, is there a way to combine this sort of top down from the institutional level, however much they're expressing inequalities and a lack of a sense of solidarity, and a way to work from the bottom up, from the individual who might feel, again, that alienation or that powerlessness to truly affect those institutions? Is there a way to get those things to work in concert? So again, there's an element of solidarity there as well, this sort of harmonious cooperative action. I guess on the side of the institution, the final question here would be, what's going to incentivize institutions to do these things that you're recommending? Yeah,
so there are a lot of, but that question raises a lot of issues. So one thing I would just point out, and I can at least point it out, can't adequately discuss it, is that a major thrust of this solidaristic response is robust democratic institutions, giving folks a meaningful say in the process that creates these institutions. The idea, when I was talking about the egalitarian nature of Rousseauian solidarity, a key idea is, you create the rules that serve this common interest through a process that gives everyone an equal say. And there's a lot of reasons why that is an important part of the process. One of the reasons is that if you don't do that, then it's very unlikely that these institutions are going to answer to everyone's interests. The people that don't have a say are just going to be ignored. Another is that if people are given a meaningful say and become part of this process, this is something that Hegel really, hammers on. That has a psychological effect on folks. You get buy-in from folks into the system, which is sort of the reverse of alienation. If they can see that that the system is accountable to them and to to others in their society, as opposed to a system that is created and maintained by a thin sliver of the population. So those are that's a key element of this solidaristic tradition, is that you go after solidarity, and part of getting and achieving solidarity and this ability to maintain the community's capacity to toe the common interest line is giving them the say so that you can get their buy-in. That's necessary to cultivating their sense that we are a group, with a common interest. Now, one of the difficult issues is, how do you get that when you have institutions like ours, and even worse in the States, where we're so far away, where we're so estranged from this policymaking process? And that's not easy, because it's very hard to wrest those reins of accountability from those who have more than their fair share of that control.
Yeah, that's a great segue into, I think, what we'll take as the final question, because the question was, how do we go about attempting to heal this fractured, factious society that we seem to be inhabiting at the moment, where there's a lack of solidarity, or at least intra and intergroup solidarity. There's solidarity within these factions, within these groups, but not common interests, or at least not seemingly and in the way that you have described. So how might we go about healing this factious society?
So that is really what I take to be a very pressing question for theorists and scholars and political actors. That is a hard problem of contemporary political philosophy and policy. I would say a couple of things. Maybe I'll just provide resources more than a direct answer. One would be this book by this sociologist at the University of California, Davis. Her name is Stephanie Mudge, and it's called Reinventing Leftism. And what she does in that book is she tracks the way leftist politics was conducted in Germany, Sweden, United States, and Britain, for the last 150 years. And she notes 3 different periods. And one of her punchlines is that in the earliest periods, go all the way up until about the 1980s, the left was deeply connected to particular communities. And it might be through, unions, or it might be through just being this organization that does more, that actively interacts and supports at a local level individual folks and responds to their problems. And what she documents is, in the 80s, what you got was the emergence of political parties that became more, and the left included, like Tony Blair, Clinton, and she would lump Obama in with this. The politics is very distant. It's all show, and it's all using the mechanisms and the tricks of public relations, and electorate managing, as opposed to kind of a conversation with the electorate. There's a real shift. So what I'd suggest to someone who's interested in, that has that kind of question that's been posed here at the end, is go read Stephanie Mudge's book to get an idea of what politics might look like that was more solidaristic, in earlier eras. On another front, I'd recommend a book by this guy. His name's Mark Blythe, B-L-Y-T-H. That's called Angrynomics. And he proposes a number of just concrete policy changes that could be enacted quickly, that would introduce a degree of solidarity just by changing the economy in certain ways. And one big proposal of his is to introduce something like a sovereign wealth fund in all democracies, where everyone owns a little bit, is given by right of birth a certain share of the productive capacity of the economy. And this isn't some crazy idea that isn't practiced anywhere. Alaska, of all places, has a very robust sovereign wealth fund, as does Norway. And the idea is that will help bind folks into this more solidaristic relationship. And then something that I would point out that I'm particularly interested in is maybe trying to get some of this political activism going through a worker-owned cooperative movement. Just a movement to put people into worker-owned cooperatives with the idea that worker-owned cooperatives will actually generate people's senses of efficacy and actually put people in a position to where they're better learners and they're more capable of organizing and processing information and becoming political actors.
Yeah, thank you
but
for that.
There's just a bunch of stuff out there. I think this is the most interesting and hottest area in political philosophy right now is stuff that's tackling this question that our respondent just asked.
Interesting. You don't have to answer this, but I wonder what the nature of the scale of those endeavors might be. If there's a sort of limit to the number. You mentioned this sort of sense of personal efficacy. I just wonder what level of scale. So if we're thinking about these cooperatives, what is that sort of workable number of people who can actually participate in the means of governance in a concrete fashion, so that they're engaging in direct participatory forms of democracy.
So I can give you a bit of an answer.
Yeah.
So sort of the poster child for all of this is this collection of cooperatives known as Mondragon in the Basque region of Spain. And this collection of cooperatives, the cooperatives, they have their own endeavors. Like some are, are grocery stores, some are agricultural producers, some are appliance makers, some like build stuff for NASA, but they're all affiliated, and they also have a bank that unifies them and a university that unifies them. And it's all aggregated together in one representative democracy of worker-owned control. And that scales up to about, I've seen 60,000 people, I've seen 80,000 people as a number. I don't know exactly, but so it scales up pretty big. It's, it's a major player in the economy of Spain. So it could scale up in that way. But also it doesn't have to scale up in that way. The idea is that you might get a bunch of little cooperatives that can be loosely associated, each generating this sense of efficacy in the folks that work in the respective cooperatives, no matter what their size.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Okay, I think we are nearing the hour and 20-minute mark, so I think we'll call it a day there. Thank you once again, Stefan, for your insights on this this topic of solidarity. Certainly a very significant and very serious issue for all of us to ponder, both in relation to this the pandemic and the lockdown measures, where we felt the power of the state perhaps more than we ever have, and also the powerlessness of the state more than perhaps we ever have. And so certainly great food for thought there. So I'll just end with the word of thanks once again to the Department of Philosophy here at McMaster University, to the alumni offices, and again to continuing education. If there's enough positive response to this sort of thing, then we'll look to roll out some more of these public philosophy talks in the future, and perhaps some more public philosophy offerings in a variety of formats in the future. So thank you for everyone who participated and who attended, and I wish you all a good night. Thank you.